All right, I am here with McCulloch, who's a retired lieutenant colonel from the Army and wrote a great leadership book that I read recently. And we're going to talk a little bit about the book and talk really about game changers. You and I met about almost 2 years ago now, I guess.
Yeah,
Right?
almost 2 years exactly. Yeah.
And you told me earlier you started writing your book that day.
Yeah. So I was lucky enough to sit through one of your presentations at the Catholic Church, at our Catholic church there. And it was a great presentation and got to go up and talk to you during the breaks and those things. And I'd always wanted to write the book. And, that's always been one of the things I wanted to do. And I've been a speaker and I've been doing speaking for quite a few years. And so I went home that night and I wrote down my table of contents for my book and I started writing it the next day. And I think your thing was on the 15th of February. I started writing it on the 16th of February, 2020. And I published the book on the 12th of February, 2021.
That's amazing. So you had something to do during the first year of.
That's right. I took advantage of that downtime.
Yeah, that's amazing. So one of the things I loved in your book is you use a lot of quotes. Have you always been a collector of quotes, or?
Yeah, I really have. I mean, okay. I've probably got a stack of papers about that thick of just quotes that I've taken. Not just, a lot of them are military quotes that I collect, which most people aren't interested in, but leadership as well. And just as anytime I get a quote, and one of the things I always tell people is that you need to have a leadership journal. Mm-hmm. And I keep one, and I have for many, many years. And I would, every time I see a quote that I was interested in, I'd write it in that journal. Of course, now I'm trying to change them all over to digital. But for years, I kept a little notebook that every time I went to a leadership presentation, every time I read a book and I'd find a quote or I'd read something that I thought was really interesting, I used to write it in write notes in the margin of the book, which is kind of worthless because most of the time you're never going to go back through the book. But if you keep it in a leadership journal, then you can go back to it pretty easily.
I love that. I'm always looking for game changers. Sometimes there are little things that you can do, and if you do it, wow, that'd be a game changer. It sounds like that process was a game changer for you in your life. Did you start?
It was. Yeah. And I've always kept I've always kept a personal journal anyway. And I've ever since I was in the 5th grade, I think I've just about every day of my life I've written something down, and I continue to do that. And so that's kind of a little bit of my self-discipline part. Even when I was deployed somewhere overseas, like in the first Gulf War in Kosovo or wherever, I always did 2 things. I always said every night before I go to bed, I have to read 10 pages out of whatever book I'm reading. And I have to do my journal every night. And so those are kind of like self-discipline things for me that like you said, are kind of game changers that I've used throughout my life.
Yeah, that's 10 minutes reading and then do your journal. Is that
right? 10 pages.
10 pages. Oh, I'm sorry, not 10 minutes.
Yeah, 10 pages of reading, and then I do my journal, and I don't care if I was going to bed at 10 o'clock at night or 2 o'clock in the morning. I made myself do those.
You would do your 10-minute, your 10 pages in your journal. And what's a typical thing you write in a journal? Are you writing about your dilemmas, your challenges, the problems you're trying to solve? Are you writing about a mindset? What are you writing about usually?
So I kind of do. It's funny because my wife, every once in a while, she'll see what I'm writing and she kind of chuckles and laughs because, I do kind of a mix. I always write when I get up and when I go to bed. That's always in my journal. So I can kind of keep track of that. But then I also, things that I do during the day, decisions I make, people I talk to. And so, especially here, where I'm talking about scholarships for young men and women. And if I meet with somebody and we talk about, if I get them a scholarship or whatever, I put that in there. So it's kind of a combination of things that I do during the day, but it's also decisions that I make and things that I'm thinking about that maybe I have to think about for the next couple of days or a month from now or whatever. But I'm trying to figure out where I want to go with those things. So and I kind of used to use it my running that way too, because I used to run a lot and I don't anymore. But I always told people that was my time to to think to myself. I could use it one of two ways. I could either try to make my mind go blank while I was running, and I did that on occasion. But most of the time, I would use it to think through some things that were going on in my life and try to come up with some answers. And so I kind of use my journal that way too.
I love that. I love that. It's funny. I just moved. We were talking about this earlier. You've moved a few times in your life, but I just moved and I have more lawn to mow than I used to. Only a few times already, and I'm out there and I'm thinking like I have a lot of friends and neighbors who don't mow their own lawn, and I've always thought I will never stop mowing my lawn because I think while I'm doing it.
Absolutely.
Once the blood is flowing, like you said with running, when the blood's flowing, and you're doing something that doesn't require all of your mental attention, it gives you a great chance to think through things. And most of my best ideas come when I'm mowing the lawn or riding a bike or doing something physical.
That's right.
Need me to be 100% there. Drive time. I used to tell people all the time, get more drive time. And I don't mean drive time in busy traffic. I mean drive time when you're doing a road trip.
Right.
And I love listening to audiobooks and while you're doing that, getting some thoughts going. Do you have a favorite quote right now or recently that really has you thinking, that has you engaged, has you challenged or inspired?
Yeah. So, of course, the one in the book that a guy, actually the guy who worked for me, one of my non-commissioned officers who worked for me, and it kind of drove the book. And it's that quote that I use, that great leadership handed down from generation to generation is what develops great nations. And when he said that, we were sitting there talking about what we were doing, commissioning second lieutenants into the United States Army. And he said that, and I thought, wow, what a great quote. And the great thing about that quote is that you can take that word nations and you can substitute anything you want into that. You can talk a business, a hospital, a university, a sports team, whatever, because leadership is fundamental to all of those things. And if you got great leadership, you're going to have a great organization. So that's one of them. But the other one that I always like to think back on and use, because I'm one of those, and my wife would tell you I'm a perfectionist. I'm always striving. Of course, none of us are perfect. The only perfect person who ever walked this earth, we put on a cross. So, I mean, it's one of those things that I want to be perfect, but none of us are. But Vince Lombardi said that perfection is unattainable, but if you keep trying, you might get to excellence. And, that to me is what I believe in, because my father, when I was growing up, he always had this thing called the 75% rule. And he'd say, son, when you're doing something, if you can't do it better than 75% of the people who are doing it, then you need to do one of two things. You either need to figure out a way to get better at it, or you need to go find something else to do. Wow. And I always growing up, he would always tell me that and emphasize that. And I took that to heart. And so now that's kind of driven me to that Vince Lombardi quote that you got to strive for perfection, understanding that you're not going to get there, but you got to get as close as you can to it.
Yeah. I love that. I love that 75% rule. I've never heard that before, but it gets at the idea that what you said about leadership going from generation to generation, right? And your father handed you a lesson that it made you uncomfortable, probably still makes you uncomfortable.
Yeah, absolutely. I always tell people that the whole crux of that and where it kind of played out in my life was I played baseball all my life, and I was a pretty good baseball player. And, all of my buddies, we'd play a game and all their dads would say, oh, great game, great game. My father, in all the years I played, and I played from the time Little League all the way through college, my father told me I played a good game one time. One time. I went 4 for 4, hit a home run, and I pitched a one-hitter that game. And he said, good game, O.
4 for 4, home run, and a one-hitter.
Yep. And he said, a good game. And, that it wasn't that he didn't think I played well, but he always told me, look, I don't care how well you play. There's something you can do better. And when I would play a game, he would take me out that night or the next morning, and he would hit me 100 balls going to my right if I had a problem going to my right, or he hit me 100 balls going to my left, or he would have me pitch a simulated 2 or 3 innings and work on certain things. And so he drove me to want to be better. And, and I had 3 brothers, and they didn't take it that way. They took it that, he was picking on them. And, so I took it as, okay, that's a challenge. And I've lived my life that way, that I'm always looking for that next challenge. Got to get better.
I love that. So what you were just talking about, it's about reminded me of something that happened yesterday. Carly Lloyd, who one of the best soccer players in history, she retired. She played her last game on the U.S. women's national team. And one of the other players, one of the teammates, posted something online, and it was a little video, and I got my attention. I thought it was hilarious. It was a little video of 4 years ago when this player, Rose Lavelle, was essentially like a rookie on the team. She was a newbie. She was, she was the the up and coming. And she got on an elevator with Carly Lloyd, who was already this, one of the best ever. And Carly Lloyd accidentally stepped on her feet and was standing in front of her, but her heels were on Rose Lavelle's toes. And Rose Lavelle took a video of this 4 years ago, little tiny video. Look, Carly Lloyd is standing on my toes. And she said, I was too nervous to say anything about it. And it got me thinking that we need people in our lives that we're a little nervous around. There's a little like uncomfortableness of, that was a good game, which means good job, but I know that there's another run, So I want to weave this into the next phase of your life right now. You're retired. You could retire and go, golf a lot or something, but you decided to write a book, and you said you're doing more and more speaking. And is it linked to that leadership passing from generation? You talk about leadership crisis. Is it?
Absolutely, it is. I'm at this point in my life, and I tell people, my passion at this point in my life is all about talking, especially to young men and women. I mean, I'll talk to businesses or whatever, and I think there's certainly things that can be gained by that. But for me, I think my focus, at least at this point in my life, is to talk to as many young men and women as I can. And maybe that's because of, the job I've had here recruiting young men and women. I see that, and I see the influence that you can have on them. But at this point in my life, that is really what I want to do, is I want to talk to as many young men and women as I can, and kind of pass along what it takes to be a good leader. Because, the whole thing about this presentation that came about was, as I was going around talking to high school students back in 2006, when I was running an Army ROTC program, I'd always ask them, I said, so what do you want to do in life when you grow up and and they say, oh, I want to lead things. I want to be a leader. And I'd say, well, that's great. The world needs more leaders. I said, what does that look like? What does that take? What does it mean? And you get that deer in the headlights look. They had no idea what it took to be a leader. They just knew they wanted to be one, and probably not for the right reasons at that point in their life. And so I came up with this presentation that kind of explained to young men and women, this is what it takes to be a leader. These are the things you have to do to be a good leader. And I always tell them, look, the things you have to do to be a good leader aren't hard. Doing them, having the discipline to do them, that's the hard part. But what you have to do isn't really hard once you know what they are. And that's kind of why I wrote the book as well. And I had people, because I did write it for 2 different groups of people. I wrote it for those young men and women, but I also wrote it for old men like me who've been a leader for 20, 30, 40 years. And I've actually had some of them who would come back after that, and they'd say, you know what, Oak, I didn't learn a whole lot of new things in your book. Those are things I've always done. They said, but what I did was I read it and I said, you know what, I used to do that really well, and I don't do that so well anymore. Maybe I need to dedicate some time to get back to doing that and remember what it was that made me successful.
I love to ask people how you really doing with that. And I put it on a 0 to 10 scale all the time. If 10 is per world class consistently and 0 is never happens, how good listener are you really?
Yeah.
We're doing a series on John Wooden's note card. Coach John Wooden, his father, when he graduated from the 8th grade, gave him a note card with 7 principles to live up to. And he was 13 when he got the note card. He kept the note card till he died just before his 100th birthday. And the note card was in his wallet for the rest of his life. And eventually all the coaches would see him take this thing out of his wallet and read through it. And they would look and say, I don't see any words on it, because he had worn the words off.
Wow.
One of those, pillar number 6, was pillar number 5 was make friendship a fine art. And, I was shooting a video on that recently, and I'm thinking that I'm a 3 at that.
Yeah.
Maybe a 5 sometimes, but even with my own siblings, with my own, in-laws, with my neighbor, I'm usually I'm not an 8 or a 9 at that.
Yeah.
I don't need a long description of it. I just need to look at reality and say, I could reach out and say, how's it going? A little more often.
So yeah, that is a great point. And, using the scale, like you said, I'll have to remember that, because that really does kind of put it in perspective, and it makes you kind of look at yourself and say, look in that mirror and say, am I really doing that? Am I doing that well? And could I do it better? And if you're honest with yourself, most of the time the answer is yes.
I love that. So as you speak, especially to young people, in a way, you're talking to yourself in the past, right? You're talking.
That's right.
When I was 17, 18, 20, I wish that I heard this. What's one of the big lessons that you want them walking away with when you go talk to a college?
Yeah. So one of the things that I'm huge on is communication. And everybody, when you say the word communication, they think talking and writing and texting, and today texting and email. But to me, a huge part of communication is the listening part. And I had a boss who taught me that. And he was a lieutenant colonel, eventually retired a lieutenant general. So a 3-star general, so obviously way smarter than me. And he taught me this lesson. And when he was a lieutenant colonel and I was a captain, we'd pass each other in the hallway in the morning as I was coming to work, probably 2 or 3 times a week, we'd pass each other. And he'd always stop and he'd say, "So how's it going, Oak?" And I started to walk past him, because I said, "Fine." And I started to walk past him because a lot of people just use that as a passing. And he stopped and he looked at me, and I thought, well, he really wants to know how I'm doing. He wants me to actually tell him how things are going. And then as we were talking, he'd ask me about my wife. He said, "So how's Kel doing?" Or "How's Oak or Kaylee doing?" Or, and he was a busy man. He was a very busy man. And not one time in all those times in that year that I worked for him and would pass him, and, like I said, 2 or 3 times a week, he'd stop me. Not one time did I ever see him look down at his watch like I got somewhere better to be. When I was talking to him, I was the most important thing going on in his life at that point. And how that made me feel, put a light bulb went off in my head. And so now I'm making an effort to same thing, ask the same thing. How are you doing? And I stop and I want an answer. And it's not just that, it's just making people understand that they're important in this organization. And no matter how busy I get, you're still important. And I want to know, and if there's something I can do to help, I want to be able to do that. And I will never forget that. And the funny thing is, I kind of lost track of this guy, this boss of mine, and I kind of thought he was a mentor for me for many years. But then when he retired and I retired, we kind of went separate ways. But after I wrote the book, I kind of reconnected with him, and I told him that story, and he said, "Wow," he said, "I never even thought about what I did and how that affected other people." So, sometimes you don't even know what you do, how it affects other people, but it can have a huge impact on people.
That's amazing. So he was just genuinely interested.
Yeah, absolutely. And I eventually I thought, was he just asking me? But then I saw he's doing that to other people as well. There was probably about 5 of us that walked through that hallway all the time. And I'd walk by and he'd be talking to somebody else like that as well. And I thought, that is huge. And that made a huge impact on me. It really did. I remembered that the rest of my life, still today. I mean, obviously I just told the story. So it's huge. It really was.
I love that you're teaching this to kids. I mean, maybe not kids, young adults, I guess. Because I think a lot about how you go through school. Let's say you're 12 years, right? Primary school. You take math 5 days a week for 45 minutes.
All right.
Do you ever listen in a way that communicates that you actually care?
Never. And unless somebody did it to you, you don't even know. No.
Yeah. And what a life lesson. I mean, you want a good marriage, you want to be a good parent, you want to be good anything. It doesn't matter. It's not just a leadership pillar. That's right.
Well, I've actually had people tell me that have read my book, that it wasn't just a leadership book. It was, if you want to be a good person, if you want to be a good team member, if you want to be, I think a lot of the things that make you a good leader make you a good person. I mean, because I think, at least in my opinion, being a servant leader and selfless service and all those things, it's all about being a good person. And if you're a good person, then you have the opportunity to be a good leader at some point, I think.
Yeah. I love that phrase, servant leader. Can I pause for a second, though? If people want to get with you for speaking or about your book, what's the best place to go? I'll give them a link too, but what's the best place to go? Should they look you up? Should they call you? Should they email you? What?
Yeah, so I do have it's on sale on Amazon, so you can type in my name, Oakland McCulloch, and there's only, as far as I know, there's only 3 Oakland McCullochs out there in the world. Me, my son, and my grandson. So you can find me that way, or you can go to my website. I have a website, ltcoakmcculloch.com, and there's a link to the book there. And on that website, I got my cell phone number, I got my email address. By all means, if you want a signed copy, you can call me, email me. We can figure out the best way to make that happen. And I probably I just went over 1,000 books sold since February, so not New York Times bestseller list by any stretch, but I'm proud of that. And a lot of those, probably about 200 of those, have been people who have reached out to me and signed copies and things like that. So I'm always happy to do that for people.
Yeah, I love that. That's phenomenal. So you mentioned servant leadership, and I love that phrase, but a lot of people tend to tell me servant leadership, I'll get stepped on, walked all over. Servant leaders, like, they're soft, they let the team do whatever it wants to do. They're friends with everybody. Give me
not true. Not true. So I always tell people, look, I am a servant leader. I believe that. And anybody who reads my book, or anybody who's ever served for me or with me, understands that that's what I am. And I said, do I seem like the guy that you're going to walk all over? I mean, that is not what servant leader is. And a lot of people mistake that. What servant leader means, that doesn't mean that you do everything that somebody wants done. Sometimes you got to make people do things that's in their best interest that they don't want to do, but it's in their best interest. And that's still part of servant leader, because you're making that person a better person. But to me, it's all about, servant leader is about, you don't care who gets credit. We want to give credit where credit is due. If somebody on your team is doing great things, you give them the credit for it. If the organization is doing great, then the organization gets credit for it, because it doesn't matter who gets credit. It matters about doing things the right way. And I always tell, the story I always tell is, we commissioned second lieutenants here in our program, and they're going out there and they're going to be lieutenants in the United States Army. And I always tell them, the day they get commissioned, I said, enjoy today, celebrate. This is a great day for you. It's all about you today. I said, once we pin those bars on your shoulder, tomorrow morning when you wake up, it will never be about you ever again. It's about the people who work for you. It's about the people you work for. It's about your organization. It's about the Army. It's about the nation. Then if we have time, we might talk about you, but it's about all those other things first.
It sounds very countercultural to me.
Yeah.
Isn't the world telling them that it is all about you?
It is.
I pick on my kids and their friends all the time with they'll put a song on when we're driving somewhere, and I'll say, let's analyze some of the lyrics of the song really quickly, and they're like, no. But every time, virtually, you pull out a few phrases and you say, like, the song is saying life is all about you. If you feel like doing it, do it. If you don't feel like doing it, don't do it. If they're not doing what you want, forget it, and it sounds like the culture isn't selling them what you just described.
Yeah, it is not. And a lot of times, that's part of one of the harder parts about this job, dealing with young men and women, is to kind of break them from that it's not about them. And chapter 2 of my book says, the title is, it's all about you. It's not about you. Or it's not about you. It's all about you. It's not about you. And it's not about the privileges that you're going to get, or the title that you're going to get, or making more money, or living in a nicer house. Those things are all nice. And that's great if you get those things as a leader, but that's not why we made you the leader. We made you the leader so that you better serve the people and the organization that you work for. And if you don't understand that, in my opinion, you're never going to be a great leader.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. I want to end with a question for you. Role models can completely change people's lives. Do you have a role model right now that you look up to? Is it someone alive? You mentioned Vince Lombardi earlier. You mentioned your father. Is there someone right now that you think, wow, I want to get a little closer to the way that person, and it could be living or dead. I think a lot of the best mentors tend to be invisible. They were someone who lived decades ago or centuries ago, and we read about them, and they make us very positively and comfortable. You have
Yeah, so I always tell people that probably the most impressive man that I ever met in real life, and I only met him once, with General Colin Powell.
Wow.
By far and away the most impressive man I ever met. And I feel lucky that I was actually allowed to be in the same tent during the first Gulf War that he was. And this is the story that I tell people. I was a general's aide, so all these generals, 1, 2, 3, 4-star generals were in this tent. And there was probably about 20 or 25 of them in this tent. And all of us aides, lieutenant to captains, colonels, were, who are taking care of these generals, we're all in the back of the tent, up against the very back of the tent, just sitting, waiting for our bosses to get done. And they're all talking, and they're really noisy in there. General Powell walks in, place was deathly silent. All these generals, all these egos in there, they knew who the boss was. Mm-hmm. And all went silent, and got to listen to him talk to the generals. That was impressive. But what was really impressive, all the aides went out before all the generals to get the vehicles ready and make sure we were all ready for when the general walks out. I was standing there when General Powell walked out of the tent, and he talked to the specialist and the sergeant the same way he was talking to the generals. Wow. And I thought, wow, that just amazed me. That, here the most powerful man in the military, in the most powerful military in the world, and he takes the time to stop and talk to the specialist and the sergeant that he will never see again when he walks out of the tent after talking to 25, 30 generals. That impressed me, and never forgot that. And I had another boss who retired, a 3-star general, and he recently told me, he said, "Oh, never turn down a chance to get your own cup of coffee." And the whole idea of that is, you don't want people to think that they got to serve you, that you can handle yourself. And I think that's what General Powell kind of taught me just in that little bit of time that I got that. Of course, I've read all his books and those kinds of things, because he is an impressive man, and his 13 rules, which are amazing. But that afternoon was really had an impact on my life.
I love it. Wow, what a perfect way to end our conversation.
Yeah. Well,
it's in a phrase. Yeah. I mean, in a word, it's authenticity, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's, and we all know it. We all know it. It's like, you don't have to write a story about that. It's good to actually care about people, regardless of who they are. We all know this, but when somebody does it, when somebody lives it,
especially somebody who doesn't have to.
Yeah, absolutely. Right.
I mean, he didn't have to stop and talk to that specialist or that sergeant. He could have just walked on by. But can you imagine the impact that made on me? Think about the impact that made on that specialist that he stopped and talked to. You think that young man won't remember that till the day he died?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. I tell you, so often in a company, I'll get the question, and I spend a lot of time in big companies, I get this question of how do we get engagement? And you want to sort of shake them and say, it's these little tiny things done well over and over and over and over again. I was in a company once that Sam Walton had built. It was one of the warehouses that feeds into the Walmart, Sam's Club world. And a woman came up to me. She was a third shift supervisor. And I said, how's it going? She said, good. All right. I said, what do you mean by that? She said, it's not what it was. She said, everything changed when Sam died. She said, Sam used to drive that little pickup truck and he'd go all over the country and he'd come here and he'd stop here at 2 a.m. because he'd be on his way somewhere and he'd come in the back door and all of a sudden you'd see him helping to load a truck.
Wow.
Or helping to open boxes. And he'd be talking to people and he'd be asking you stuff. And he would ask, what ideas do you have that nobody's listening to you? And what do you guys do that every other place that we got should be doing? And what's frustrating you right now? And she said he would actually ask questions and then actually listen to the answer.
Right.
And she said, when Sam died, all of a sudden we had these these MBAs come and do the PowerPoint meetings in the boardroom in the front and never stop in the back anymore.
Never ask a question.
Yeah. And if they did, it was just to get, they weren't really, and it's your moment with Colin Powell,
Yeah, absolutely.
Really talking to real people. So, yeah. Well, thank you for what you do, Oak. I appreciate it. Thanks for taking the time to have this conversation. And
thank you for having me, Jonathan. I never turned down a chance. Like I said, I never turned down a chance to talk to young men and women and get the message out there because I think it's so important right now. The world needs some good leadership examples out there so that the youth coming up, going back to that quote that got to hand down that great leadership from generation to generation. And I think that's what we're doing right now. You, me, and a bunch of other of us like that.